Good morning. My name is Josh. I'm a historian here at Edison Ford Winter Estates. Today we're going to be talking about Ellen Biddle Shipman, who is one of the country's first women landscape architects. Um, this is of interest to me as I was an environmental historian for my master's program. And so I'm interested in national parks, gardens, landscape architects, stuff like that. So not very well known lady, but that's changing with time. And so we're going to get into it and talk about where she came from, how she got into the industry that she worked in, and some of the work that she did over time. So let's go ahead and get started. Um, we're going to actually start at the end, as all good stories do. So, upon Ellen Biddle Shipman's death, all of her correspondence and personal papers were destroyed per her request by her family. The reason for this can only be speculative. However, it clearly presents certain difficulties for the historian. And so I didn't know this before I started the project, but I found out pretty quick that there was not a whole lot of primary source material about Ellen. As a result, following in the footsteps of other scholars, we'll focus on her professional life with particular attention paid to the aesthetic and cultural impact of her gardens. And maybe that's the only legacy she desired. She didn't really want to be known for whatever may have been happening in her personal life. She wanted to be known for her work. And as we move through, you'll probably start to kind of get the idea that there is something else happening behind the scenes. But as historians, obviously, we need to stick to the facts and the story that is told with what we have for sources. And so she comes from the Biddle family. And this is actually a very famous family here in the United States. There's basically a military wing and a financial wing of the family. William and Sarah Biddle emigrated from England to Burlington, New Jersey in 1681. They were Quakers escaping religious persecution. Their grandsons, William III and John, actually settle in Philadelphia around 1725. And so, if you do hear of the Biddles, they're usually known as the Philadelphia Biddles. They actually also became intertwined with the Drexel family, if you're familiar with them. Central to American history over several generations, prominent politicians, bankers, lawyers, military officers, artists, writers, and philanthropists. Some of the famous members of the family, William Biddle, of course, we mentioned, he helped found the West Jersey colony. Edward Biddle served in the First Continental Congress. Clement was an advisor to George Washington, while Charles worked with Ben Franklin. James Biddle, probably one of the more famous members of the family. He actually claimed Oregon for the United States, and he also helped open trade to China and Japan. And then Nicholas Biddle was the president of the Second National Bank, and he actually was the patriarch of Andalusia, the ancestral home of the Biddle family here. He was in a long-term battle with Andrew Jackson over the future of banking here in the United States. Ellen Biddle Shipman's parents directly. We start with her father, Brigadier General James Biddle. He was the grandson of Colonel Clement Biddle, who served with Ben Franklin there. He fought for the Union in the Civil War and then went on to lead several Reconstruction efforts throughout the South. And he was later stationed at various Western outposts as the country expanded out west. Her mother, Ellen Fish McGowan Biddle, her father, John McGowan, actually commanded the merchant ship Star of the West. And that was the ship that had the first shots fired between North and South at Fort Sumter. Not part of the war properly, but the first shots that were fired upon his ship. She wrote a book called Reminiscences of a Soldier's Wife, and that's actually where we get a lot of information about Ellen's early childhood. Ellen Biddle Shipman herself was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on November the 5th, 1869. Her family's actually living at a military outpost in Brenham, Texas, but her mother travels back to Philadelphia to give birth in civilization. She had two older brothers, David Harmony Biddle and Nicholas Biddle. Nicholas actually manages John Jacob Astor IV's fortune after his death on the Titanic. And so Ellen grew up in the Western territories of Texas, Nevada, Colorado, and Arizona. Her hobbies included horseback riding, hiking, and camping. Ellen's mother describes her as happy as a bird, quite tall for her age, rode well, and was perfectly fearless, also hardy and strong, owing to the outdoor life in that wonderful climate. And so if she had spent her entire childhood on the Western frontier, it's likely that her aesthetic sensibility would have been drastically different. We probably would have never gotten Ellen Biddle Shipman as we know her today. and her entry into the circles of high society may have been precluded by her lack of experience in such spaces. However, because her father worked for the army, she would attend military balls in San Francisco, and that would kind of give her an idea of what high society was like. Furthermore, due to hostilities in the West, she would travel to her grandparents' farm at times in New Jersey, and there she would encounter yet another radically different landscape. This is a young Ellen. In 1875, she's sent to live with her grandparents in New Jersey for finishing school. Her parents want her to be socialized with girls of her own age. Ellen's reluctant. She wants to stay out west and keep riding horses and hiking. She credits both her father and her grandparents for cultivating a great love of growing things. And here we can compare the starkness of the West versus the green fertility of New Jersey. As I said, both of these things are important in her development as a landscape architect. Out west, we have the mountains and the desert versus the cultivated flowers and white picket fences of New Jersey, which has been settled by now. And so the West becomes true nature, sublime, dangerous, raw, and the garden is a safe haven, an artifice. It's an embellishment of nature, not true nature itself. She goes to Baltimore for more schooling as a teenager. A teacher actually finds her notebook full of house and garden plans and gives her an architectural dictionary. So, from a very young age, she's very interested in the home and the garden. In 1887, her father is reassigned to the War Department. Her parents moved to Washington, D.C., and Ellen is further acclimated to high society. And by the early 1890s, she's living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in a rented house with a group of female friends. I believe there are 5 of them living in the house. This is very scandalous for this time. Usually, women would not live together by themselves. And maybe this is a hint at the beginning of the story that is playing in the background. But one of her roommates is Marion Nichols. She was the sister of Rose Standish Nichols and sister-in-law of Arthur Shercliffe, both of whom are very well-known landscape architects. And so we can see where the beginning of these connections that she makes, being able to network with these other people, will help her in her career. I always like to ask when I'm giving this presentation live if anybody notices anything interesting about this picture, and I'll give you a second to look at it and see if you can figure it out, and then I'll give you the answer. But if you look at the picture, you can see how the entire picture is framed at a slanted angle here. And so Ellen was actually, this is her soon-to-be husband, Lewis, and you can tell that the way they have the picture framed here, she was actually about a head taller than her husband. And so very clearly they did not want to portray that size difference. And so they slant the picture and perch his hat right up on top of his head here so that he looks taller. And so she attends Radcliffe, which is basically Harvard for women, at 23 years old in 1892. She was possibly involved in the suffrage movement, although we don't have a whole lot of evidence for that, aside from her living situation and, of course, the way that she carried herself throughout the rest of her life. She withdraws from school after just 1 year, as does her soon-to-be husband, Louis Shipman, who is also attending Harvard. Lewis is described as charming and lively with literary aspirations. He's descended from a well-established upstate New York family. His father is a New York City contractor, and he's actually the cousin of another one of her housemates, Mary Rogers. They're married in October of 1893 and moved to Connecticut soon after. Their first child is then born in August of 1894, and her name is also Ellen Biddle Shipman. We're going to take a little side quest here. We're going to head out to New Hampshire to the Cornish art colony. And so sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens, he was actually the uncle of her former housemate, Marion Nichols. He arrives in Cornish, New Hampshire in 1885. He's drawn to the rural beauty of a classic Arcadian landscape. He buys and renovates an old farmhouse as a summer home and studio named Aspet. Other artists, writers, sculptors, and designers soon follow, and many of them are trying to escape the hustle and the bustle of New York City and the summer heat. And so some of the famous residents of Cornish Art Colony we'll come across a couple of these names as we move through, as I show you some paintings and stuff and some of their statues. Winston Churchill, not the British politician, but the American novelist, still pretty famous in his own right. Ethel Barrymore was actually Drew Barrymore's great aunt. Isadora Duncan, a very famous dancer. Let's see. We also have Maxfield Parrish, who, if you've never seen any of his work, he actually worked for Edison, uh, making advertisements for his lamps. And if you get a chance to check out those paintings, they're really cool. Charles Platt, we'll talk about in just a moment. He was the foremost country home designer in the US around this time. Of course, St. Gaudens, Ellen, and Woodrow Wilson actually had his summer White House here in Cornish. And so Ellen and Lewis arrive in Cornish in the summer of 1894. And here's a quote from Ellen herself. The valley was still filled with rolling clouds. In the distance was a Scutney mountain, and just a few feet below, where we stood upon a terrace, right down here, was a sunken garden with rows bathed in moonlight of white lilies standing as an altar for a Scutney. As I look back, I realize it was at that moment that garden became for me the most essential part of a home. But years of work had to intervene before I could put this belief born that glorious night into actual practice. And just as a side note, this is High Court, and this is owned by Annie Lazarus, who is an art patron here in Cornish. And so from 1894 to 1895, the Shipmans actually stay with author Herbert Croly and his wife. Upon Lewis, her husband, selling his story, The Curious Courtship of Kate Poins, the Shipmans move into an old brick house nearby in Plainfield, right down the street from Cornish, and rename it the Poins House. No one else thought of trying to live in the house but the Shipmans, with their instinct for what could be made charming, saw its possibilities. Ellen especially had a knack for finding old furniture to outfit rooms that seemed made for it. And so we see the beginnings of her ability to make something from nothing and really use vernacular local materials to create something which will come in handy in uh, the ways that she works later. And so Ellen marks her calling cards geographically in Plainfield, socially in Cornish, which is indicative of the gravity that the colony holds from the beginning. She really wants to be able to be part of this Cornish art colony. And she creates her first real garden here at Poins House. It's a simple New England country garden, a dirt path lined with borders of traditional summer flowers and separated from the road by a low stone wall. And while this early garden seems somewhat humble in its design, it is an early example of the colonial revival design that would become integral to her work, as well as the wider world of American gardens in the post-Victorian era. And this is actually Ellen here working in her garden. One critic calls Cornish the most beautifully gardened village in America. While none of the residents were trained botanists or horticulturalists, they were intimately acquainted with the principles of design. And so this lack of formal training prevents an over-reliance on established conventions, creates a landscape that's deeply personal to the residents, and it has strong bonds to the local vernacular architecture. The resulting aesthetic is therefore more closely related to the forms of landscape painting than any dominant gardening standards of the time. And this is part of the reason why this topic interested me so much, is because I love landscape painting. I'm a big fan of the Hudson River School, Thomas Cole especially. But this painting here is of St. Gaudens Garden by another member of the Cornish art colony, Edith Perlwitz. Life in the Cornish art colony is industrious. Social calls are discouraged prior to 4 p.m. However, when they do get together, the interactions are similarly cultured and energetic, with dinner parties, games of charades, and masks, which are basically like plays. The one pictured here is called The Mask of Ours, The Gods and the Golden Bowl, and this took place in 1905. It was performed to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the establishment of the Cornish art colony. It was written by Ellen's husband, Lewis Shipman, and Ellen actually plays Minerva, goddess of the arts and wisdom, and she presents Augustus St. Gaudens with the golden bowl to signify his ascension to the throne, replacing Jupiter as king of the gods. A little while later, they moved to a new home, and this is called Brook Place, and this is also in Plainfield, right down the street from Cornish. This is in 1903. And this was formerly the John Gilkey farm. They planned to remodel this house and build another one on the property to overlook Mount Ascutney, as High Court did. But plans changed with the financial panic of 1907. And instead, they renovate the house. It almost doubles in size. The grounds encompass nearly 200 acres. Down here, this is a painting of Brook Place by the Cornish art colony resident Willard Metcalf. And so Brook Place allows Ellen to continue developing her approach to both interior and garden design. It's an overarching aesthetic that provides a seamless transition from inside to outside, and that will continue to mature, and it'll be best displayed in later projects like Longview in New Orleans, as well as Beekman Place, which is her New York City residence, and we'll see those a little bit later. Hallmark features include a secret door in the library leading to a private study for her husband, a large picture window with 120 curved panes of glass imported from England, and paneling salvaged from a Vermont church. So again, we're able to see where she's able to take different materials and kind of put them together into a cohesive vision. The property is described by various friends and journalists as refined yet imaginative, filled with charm, seclusion, and informality. The landscape harmonized entirely with the dwelling. Ultimately, Brook Place becomes a working laboratory for Ellen's continued studies, a de facto resume for her entry into the professional ranks, and a home base for the family for the remainder of her lifetime. Take a sip of water here. So they have three children. Of course, we've already talked about Ellen Biddle Shipman. Then they have a son, Evan, and another daughter, Mary, in 1907. Ellen, the younger, the oldest of the three children, assumes many of the domestic and childcare responsibilities after her father leaves, and that allows her mother to pursue her professional career. So Lewis left the family and traveled to London, and the Shipmans are actually divorced in 1910. This is a very uncommon occurrence back at this time. Women didn't really get divorced. They would usually suffer in silence. Lewis is drawn to the cosmopolitan life of the city and celebrity. He's an inspiring author and playwright. Ellen prefers the more intimate and natural environment of the artist colony. Lewis did eventually remarry near the end of his life in 1926 to the actress Lucille Watson. She was known as Queen of the Dowagers. She had a very sour face, and she always played the mean old lady in all of her movies. There's no indication that he ever returns stateside or ever cultivates any relationships with his daughters. In fact, they were left out of his will. However, he does reunite with his son Evan later in life in Paris in 1924. Evan also becomes close friends with Ernest Hemingway and Gertrude Stein as part of the Lost Generation. Evan's life also very interesting. He was one of the foremost horse racing writers in the U.S. at the time. The story about how he meets Hemingway. He actually went looking for a friend in Paris, goes and knocks on a door, and Hemingway answers the door. They become friends and go on a series of adventures. So if you're interested in learning more about that, there is some information out there about Evan's life as well. And so these are some of the descriptions about Lewis Shipman given by friends and people that knew him. A fat, roly-poly author and playwright, dripping with perspiration and pouring forth a continuous line of boasting and teasing. His absurdity is his safety. He is one that would bludgeon a lily before breakfast and be proud of it all day. And my favorite, the warmest and most deleterious of friends, the bitterest and most innocuous of enemies. So this guy seemed like he was a real piece of work. But his absence creates both financial need and personal freedom and leads to Ellen's decision to become a landscape architect. And so we're going to talk about Charles Platt for just a moment. Charles Platt was a resident of the Cornish art colony. He was a landscape painter when he first arrived in 1889 as a summer resident following the tragic death of his wife and two young children. His brother William is a landscape architect, and he's actually apprenticing to Frederick Law Olmsted, who is basically the godfather of landscape architecture. He designed Boston's Emerald Necklace, as well as the park system in Buffalo, and of course, most famously, Central Park in New York City. Together, the Platts traveled to Italy in 1892. Charles records his travels throughout several villas and gardens with text and photographs, publishes them as a series of articles, and then in 1894, they are compiled into the book Italian Gardens. And so while the rolling hills of the Cornish countryside do bear a passing resemblance to the Tuscan landscape, Platt merges Italian concepts with local conditions and vernacular forms and creates a distinctly Cornish style, and eventually it becomes very much a foundation for an American style around the turn of the century. And so his first professional Cornish commission was High Court for Annie Lazarus, that picture we saw earlier of the mountain. And he becomes widely recognized as the foremost American architect of country homes. So in 1899, the Shipmans are staying at his home while renovations are being completed at their first house, Poyntz House. Upon returning from a trip from New York, Charles Platt finds Ellen's house plans on his drawing board and encourages her to continue. He gives her a drawing board, a T-square, and drafting elements with an accompanying note. If you can do as well as I saw, you better keep on. And later on, he cites her work at Brook Place, her second home, as an indication of her skill, and he asks her to assist with the planting plans for his architectural commissions. Simultaneously, he offers to provide her with instruction in the finer points of architecture and the formal techniques of drafting and design. And so their first collaboration is actually Fine Mere in Cooperstown, New York, around 1913. This is a home owned by the descendants of the novelist James Fenimore Cooper. The Maiden of Fine Mere over here, just below my head, was sculpted by Cornish art colony resident Herbert Adams. Cooper, the senior, is displeased with her work. He says that she ruined the place, but his son thinks that her design is the most beautiful place he'd ever seen. Not grand, but home-like and heartwarming. And we'll see some quotes later from Ellen that will give you an indication of the fact that this was on her mind very early on in her career and continued throughout. Admittedly, it is weak in comparison to her later work. She's kind of following Platt's lead, but the difficulties presented by the owner and a healthy dose of imposter syndrome create a relatively unfair self-criticism. This home is no longer here. This is the entryway here, but you can still see Ellen's borders right down here on the entryway. I like to include all of the design plans. They're very interesting and works of art in their own right. And as we move through, you'll see as those develop as well. The next home is the Causeway, and this was owned by the Parmalees in Washington, D.C. This was completed in 1914. It's an excellent example of the Platt-Shipman collaboration, as well as an early example of Ellen's ability to adjust her designs according to both the landscape and the desires of the owners. And as we'll see a little bit later, that wasn't always very common for landscape architects in those days. She comes back in 1915 to continue working on the landscape design as a Christmas present for the Parmalees. This also shows us that she has a very intimate relationship with her clients, which also was not really common. But she creates her largest woodland garden design, and it's actually one of the few examples of its type still in existence today. She then returns once again in 1927 to do some more work on the property. According to her biographer, Judith P. Tankard, and at this point, I'll just take a little side note to let you know that basically as I said, there's not a lot of information about Ellen, and so Tankard is actually the authoritative author on the subject, and most of the information that we have here in this presentation is from her. She wrote The Gardens of Ellen Biddle Shipman. It's a very good book. And gives you a lot of beautiful pictures of her gardens and everything like that. But there's not a lot of other source material out there to talk about Ellen. So if you're interested in learning more after this, I would look up Judith B. Tankard for her work. And so this early collaboration does betray Ellen's relatively undeveloped design sensibility, as it appears she's largely following Platt's lead and emulating the formality of his strong architectural framework, as opposed to counterbalancing it with a richer, less orderly, more original style. So the gardens are kind of really blending in with his architecture as opposed to serving that counterbalance. But with her repeated trips to the estate and later years, she's able to put her mark on the grounds, and today it's widely considered to be one of her most notable pieces of work. Here are some more pictures of Tregoron. And so, as you can see, woodland garden, very different from some of the other stuff that we'll see later on with her work. Over here, you can't really see it in this picture because it's not very clear, but this is the National Cathedral. The Parmalees were actually big benefactors for the National Cathedral, and they wanted to be able to see it from their house. And so I'm always interested in the ways that landscape architects are able to create those vistas. And here's the initial Platt design. for the estate. And this is her garden plan for the woodland area, given as a Christmas present in 1915. You can see how there's basically a spine running through the property. And so this really isn't as formal as what we would imagine in these days. Most everything was pretty straightforward, straight lines, axial designs, but they're both able to create something that blends in with the landscape. And so one of the first successful, artistically successful and truly symbiotic collaborations between Platt and Shipman was Girdle Ridge, and this is owned by William Fennistock in Cortona, New York. Ellen actually replaced the Olmsted firm after they were dismissed from the project. These two pictures here on the bottom, two are my favorite examples of her work, actually, that I came across. But here she's able to achieve balance between the robust architectural structure of Platt's design and the romantic sensuality of her own lush gardens. Another early piece of work for her was the Alger House in Grosse Pointe, Michigan. It's now known as the Grosse Pointe War Memorial. This is in 1919. Alger was a lumber baron and industrialist, and perhaps best known as the co-founder of Packard Motor Company. This is the first of 44 projects that Ellen would complete in Grosse Pointe over the course of her career. This is the most of any locale in her portfolio, and this indicates the power of networking in circles of high society during the Gilded Age, as well as the esteem in which her designs are held by the elite families of the day. Tankard, her biographer, also cites this work as a benchmark for the maturation of her design sensibility. I'll show you a couple more pictures of this space. This is an English knot garden that she created for the War Memorial, and it is still actually extant today. And that is the plan for that English knot garden. And this is the larger estate here. Very beautiful drawings that she does. And so she's come into her own and she's ready to move on and take the next big step. And so she moves to New York City. 1920 moves her firm to New York City. It's located at Beekman Place on the corner of East 50th Street with views of the East River. This includes her office, her residence, and 2 apartments upstairs. This presents her with another opportunity to continue her development as a holistic designer, integrating interior and exterior spaces. The move to New York also allows her to garner added visibility as a landscape architect, gives her some credibility and access as well to both materials and clients, and it accompanies her growth into recognition as one of the premier landscape architects in the country. Additionally, it allows her to hire staff as her commissions increase. She does maintain her residence at Brook Place in Plainfield, which serves as her summer residence for now. And so Ellen employed women exclusively, many of whom graduated from the Lothrop School. The Lothrop School is a school for landscape architecture, gardening, and horticulture for women in Groton, Mass. In 1901, it was founded. And so this was founded by a woman named Judith Eleanor Motley Lowe. There are 17 acres of meadows, orchards, gardens, greenhouses, mostly planted and maintained by the students themselves. There was a focus on private residential gardens as opposed to large commercial or public spaces, and we'll see how that plays into Ellen's work as well. She would spend a lot of time speaking at the Lothrop School as well. And as I said, found a lot of her employees from the school, generally focused on naturalistic Edwardian English garden design, but there were some studies of formal Italian gardens as well. Let's see if we can go back here. Yeah. So she did believe women were particularly suited to the work, and she wanted to provide an opportunity for women in a field that was still dominated by men. Conversely, most men wouldn't have applied for a job owned by a woman, and so it made it very easy for her to pick out the brightest out of the Lothrop School and have them come work for her. The general field of architecture was extremely divided by gender in the early years. When women are given opportunities, rarely, they're almost always restricted to the work of choosing plants for their gardens, while the real work of architecture was dominated by men. This is in the professional ranks, but then that division of labor is reflected in the home. The ladies, they are able to pick out, some things, but mostly plants. And the actual decision making is dominated by the man of the house. But by the late 1920s, she employed 5 draftswomen, as many as 10 more women working on temporary basis, and 2 secretaries. And so here we're going to go into some quotes from Ellen. She had a unpublished garden book. She was putting together basically a book of philosophy for garden design. It was never published, but we do have some pieces of that book still able to be reviewed today. And so we're going to talk about some of her attitudes and philosophies over this next little part here. And so she said the renaissance of the art was due largely to the fact that women, instead of working over their boards, I'm not really sure if that means the boards in the garden or boards were also meant to mean in the kitchen. Either way, they were able to get outside and start to use plants as if they were painting pictures and as an artist would. Before women took hold of the profession, landscape architects were doing what I call cemetery work. Very boring. Until women took up landscaping, gardening in this country was at its lowest ebb. And there is no profession so suited to women, so needed and so repaying in every way, nor any that at once gives so much of health, wealth, and happiness. On democracy, not only for women, she thought that this would open the door for everybody. And so your garden plan is the key that will open the door into a new world, a world where many of the great people of the earth, rich and poor, high and low, have worked and slaved to recreate the beauty that man has so often destroyed into the paradise it was meant to be. And so we see not only her feminism, but her dedication to democracy and equality, and also her conservationist or environmentalist ideals. Gardening opens a wider door than any of the other arts. All mankind can walk through, rich or poor, high or low, talented and untalented. It has no distinctions. All are welcome. We're all the same when we have our hands in the dirt. On memory and humanity. And so the home is very, very important to her, as we'll see here. Our memory of our childhood home is not the architecture of the house, but the fragrance of the lilac, lily of the valley, jasmine, or the blooming of the rose. And probably my favorite quote from Ellen. If you are planning to build a home, you are embarked on man's greatest achievement. It is for its protection that wars are fought, and for its beautification that other arts have been developed. It was the building of a home, one stone upon another, and the cultivation of the surrounding land that differentiated man from beast more than any one other thing. Do not take this a great experience casually. Give it all the consideration such a momentous undertaking should receive. And so I really think that coming from the Western frontier, being moved around a lot as a military kid, this idea of home really roots itself in her life very early. And then when she has her domestic problems with her husband later on, probably that just reinforces it. And so, one of the most important things in an Ellen Biddle Shipman garden is privacy. And we see that with our moonlight garden here on the estate grounds, which we will talk about in a little bit. But a couple more quotes here from Ellen. This point cannot be too strongly stressed and will be reiterated and reiterated until the reader grasps the point that privacy is the most essential attribute of any garden, whatever type or period. Planting, however beautiful, is not a garden. A garden must be enclosed, or otherwise it would just be a cultivated area. Some gardens, like some homes, afford little more privacy than a shop window. Better one room that is your own than a whole house exposed to the world. Better a tiny plot where you can be alone than a great expanse without this essential attribute of the real garden. And this idea of privacy is very much related to her feminism as well. She's trying to give these ladies a place to be, a place to belong. And so we'll talk about some of her philosophies of design, a very intimate relationship between the garden and the home. Very much the garden is related to the building that sits next to. You can see that here at our moonlight garden, actually. The study that the moonlight garden sits next to is approximately the same size and very much of the same design sensibility. Very simplistic skeletons that should be basic spatial arrangements that allow for the focus to remain where it should be, which is on the plants and the garden architecture. Those are the important parts. Keep to the original lay of the land, restrict regrading and replanting, make it natural, allow your land to do the talking and tell you where you should be going with it instead of changing it all into a very synthetic, human. You want to be human, but still try to keep it natural as well. Um, Plan a garden according to the client's desires. As we were talking about, landscape architecture, very much a divided, gendered industry in the early days. Usually, the male landscape architects would come in and they would say, "You're going to do this, you're going to do this, this is what this should be," without really any consideration for the client's desires. Ellen's approach was much more cooperative with the homeowner, and we'll see some examples of that when we talk about some of her later work. Informal yet engaging drawings, alluding to the romanticism of her style, combining schematic layouts with charming vignettes. I'll show you some of those. They actually used to use watercolors as well, and there's some very beautiful works that she would send to her clients. Consider the larger landscape when designing a garden in its midst. It's not there by itself. It's definitely a part of the larger landscape, and it's important to take that into consideration. Make deliberate choices about the choice and arrangement of plants, their relationships with one another, as well as the architectural elements around them. She would also send meticulously detailed horticultural instructions, and we'll see some of those as well, balanced with the personal language of a letter to the client. So, as I said, she had a very close personal relationship with a lot of her clients, which really wasn't the norm back then. Approach a garden as a painter would with a palette. Unique and exotic plants may be interesting, but generally serve to detract from the larger cohesion of the picture that's being painted. And we'll see this a little bit as we talk about the two major schools that she worked in, which were arts and crafts and colonial revival. We're coming from the Victorian era where we are studying the flower on a stem. It's very isolated, it's very scientific. She wants to create a holistic kind of view of the garden. And of course, as we mentioned, a sense of mystery and privacy engendered with smaller, secluded, and separate spaces. Often they are revealed as one moves through the space. So you'd come into the first part of the garden, and then that will open up into a second part. And as you move through, you're also going to get further away from the house, and you're going to move from a more structured, more formal setting into something that more closely approximates the wilderness. And so here are some of these designs that she would send to her clients. As I said, very, very interesting, intricate. You can see the little vignettes here and here. She would also use watercolors and the very explicit instructions for all of the plants. But these themselves are works of art and definitely probably helped with convincing clients to hire her. And so some of the common elements of a Shipman garden, axial design is very important. Basically, you have very straight lines. Everything is based around those axes. Fountains, sundials, dovecotes or pigeonniers, statues, loggia. And loggia would be if you basically have this open air, one side is enclosed on the side of the building, and then you have the pillars giving you that open air outside. Reflecting pools, one of which is in our moonlight garden here on the estate. Copse or bosquet. This is the moonlight garden. You'll have the backdrop of the evergreens here. Benches, pergolas. Pergolas would be freestanding as opposed to the loggias here. Borders. Ellen was actually famous for her borders. That may be her most defining characteristic of her gardens. She was very well known for those. Trellises and parterres, which go along with the axial design. Some of her favorite flowers and plants. This is by no means an exhaustive list, depending on where she was planting and what the client wanted and all of that. These would change, obviously, but some of these that show up throughout a majority of her gardens. I'll just kind of click through, and at the end, you'll be able to see how they all go together in certain ways. One of my favorites, of course, is the wisteria. It's very beautiful. Espaliered fruit trees, they actually bind the branches so that they will basically flatten out, and then you can use them as a border around your garden. All right. And so, as I mentioned, she worked in two major movements around the turn of the century here. The first one is known as colonial revival. And so this starts with post-Civil War Reconstruction era. There's a lot of rapid social and cultural changes here in the US, a lot of industrialization, urbanization, increased immigration. Of course, we're coming out of the excesses of the Victorian age. And so there's a nostalgia for a simpler time, resulting in the revival of an idealized version of the colonial past. This first comes popular with the 1876 Centennial Expo in Philadelphia. Uh, Basically a romanticized aesthetic through the use of colonial imagery, doesn't intend to recreate an authentic version of colonial America. It's not historical in nature. It's more vibes, colonial vibes, not based on archaeological research or historical documentation, as I said, although it can include authentic colonial materials and design elements. Colonial Revival gardens capture the spirit of the finest 18th century colonial gardens while creating a style uniquely American. They are among the most beautiful gardens ever created in this country, among the most popular styles of the 20th century, and the appeal of Colonial Revival design endures today. Some of the hallmarks of colonial revival: formal, orderly, symmetrical design, straight, not meandering paths or walks, typically paved with brick. Distant focal point, typically a sundial, sometimes a fountain, an urn, or a statue. Enclosures of boxwood or privet hedges, fences, white picket, always preferred, or low walls. Again, that focus on privacy. Geometric but very lush flower beds, and romantic garden structures such as trellises, arbors, and pergolas. The other major tradition that Ellen worked in was the arts and crafts movement, and this emerges in the mid-19th century in England, starts as a reaction to the stuffy formality of the high Victorian design style, as well as the highly artificial manufactured opulence of the Industrial Revolution. Also came to America via Philadelphia in 1876, the first World's Fair. It was first adopted by potters, but eventually spread across different genres. And there's the hallmark of arts and crafts, it's an emphasis on local, vernacular, and regional materials. And so it gives it a very strong sense of place. And so this is the interior design of arts and crafts. But as you can see here, there's very much a crossover into the outdoor space. And so some of the hallmarks of arts and crafts, you have garden rooms, of which are Moonlight Garden here on the estate is a very good example. They're basically divided into distinct areas or rooms, gives a structured sequence of spaces that guide the visitor. It's always integrated with the architecture. The garden is an extension of the home with hard landscaping and planting designed to complement the home's architecture. Strong structure, soft planting. So clear framework provided by paths, terraces, hedges, but these are softened by the planting. And always, again, as I said, local and handmade materials. Local materials emphasizes traditional craftsmanship and stays true to the movement's core values. There's a natural harmony. The garden is designed to fit harmoniously within the local environment and draws on the surrounding landscape. Year-round interest. The flowers aren't interesting just in the summer. They rotate throughout the year, and so the gardens are interesting and beautiful all times of the year. Of course, architectural forms, as we said, in addition to structural elements like terraces, we'll have architectural forms such as clipped topiary and shaped hedges. And varying formality. As I mentioned before, the design tends to be more formal closer to the house and becomes less formal the further you get away, and it blends with the wider and wilder countryside. And here, as I mentioned, Frederick Law Olmsted, basically godfather of landscape architects, this is what he had to say about the arts and crafts movement. I do not think much of the fine and costly gardening of Italy, hunt for beauty in commonplace and peasant conditions, rustic stables, sheds, pergolas and trellises, seats and resting places, and of all such things as are made lovely by growths that seem natural and spontaneous. And so both the colonial revival and the arts and crafts aesthetics are historically determined as direct responses to the ornate excesses of the Victorian era, as well as the positivist impulses of the American technological revolution. It rejects the fascination with the rigid control and objective display of nature in favor of handcrafted, nostalgic, and harmonious relationships with the natural world. And so we can see how these traditions really fit in with Ellen's work. And so here we come to Mina Edison, who was the second wife of Thomas Edison. And this is how we have the connection between Ellen Biddle Shipman and Edison Ford Winter Estates. And so, born in Akron in 1865, gardening was a very significant part of her life in both private and public settings. She formed beautification committees and garden clubs. She organized tours, and she spent considerable time and effort administering to the landscapes of her homes. The garden was a place where she could encourage not only public education and social interaction, as well as conservationist ideals, but it was also a place for her to find an escape from the everyday stresses of being Mrs. Thomas Edison, which I believe she probably needed. And so the first time that Mina and Ellen worked together is actually at the Miller Cottage in Chautauqua, New York in 1922. Mina's father, Lewis, dies, and the cottage is left to her. And so within a couple of years, she calls Ellen to come in and help her with the design of that space. Unfortunately, not a whole lot of pictures of it, but definitely if you get a chance to visit there, I'm sure it's very interesting. This is actually a little piece I found, and it's supposed to be the bill. So this was in actually uh, minus collections. But I believe it's actually a price list. So it's labeled as the bill, but I think it's a price list because it's pretty general. You can see first consultation, $100, plans, 150 to 250, percentage points on the construction and architectural plans and the planting plans. Foreman's time per day, $10. So probably a little more expensive today, but and then she would, of course, order everything that they needed for the garden as well. But as we'll see, she would spend a lot of time on the grounds with her clients. And so this time away from office per day, $50 was probably where she made a lot of her money. And here's the blueprint for the Miller house, drawn up by Ellen for Mrs. Thomas Edison, Mina Edison. And so here we see where she begins to ingratiate herself into this circle of Gilded Age families, high society, the most famous and richest residents of the country. She came to work for Mina again at Glenmont in West Orange, New Jersey, designed a skating pond in 1926. Not 100% sure that those plans were ever put in place, but she was called to rescue that project as it was flailing, and then returned again in 1929 and 1937 to work on the flower garden. She also went to Fairlane in Dearborn, Michigan. That's the Ford's home up in Michigan. And she actually redesigned Clara Ford's Rose Garden, which is obviously very famous. And then we have Stan Hewitt down in Akron, Ohio. And that is owned by the Cyberlings, who owned Goodyear. So she worked for all of these people, and they all knew each other. And of course, I'm sure that her reputation preceded her when she was looking for new clients. And so I had mentioned at the beginning that all of her correspondence and personal papers have been destroyed. These are the only three letters that I could find with her name on the letterhead. And these actually come from Mina's archives, not Ellen's. But it's basically three letters to Mina asking her, I'm ready to come see the site. These are the ideas I have. Let me know what you need. Let me know when I can come. We don't have any record of Mina actually answering her. But yeah, these are the only three letters that we could find as far as things that Ellen had written, primary source material. And so here we have Mina and Thomas sitting in the Moonlight Garden here at Edison Ford Winter Estates in Fort Myers, Florida. And this was constructed in 1929. And so in 1928, Henry Ford actually took Thomas Edison's original 1886 laboratory here from the grounds in Fort Myers and took it up to Greenfield Village, his museum up in Dearborn, Michigan. And so he liked to collect old buildings. He has the Wright brothers' original garage. He has Edison's lab from both Fort Myers and Menlo Park. He has the chair that Lincoln was sitting in when he was assassinated, as well as the car that Kennedy was riding in when he was assassinated, the bus that Rosa Parks rode on. From what I understand, it takes a better part of 2 days to get through all of that. And so it's pretty expansive. Um, you know, he had to enter into negotiations with Mina for the release of the laboratory. She wasn't a fan of the idea of it going. And so, in exchange for certain financial considerations, he was able to extract that lab. His workers came in, took pictures, labeled everything, and took a foot of topsoil from underneath the lab so that it would always sit on Fort Myers ground. And as I said, you can still see that lab up in Michigan today. In exchange, he pays for the construction of a study for Thomas's birthday. This replaces the footprint of the missing building, as well as the garden directly behind it. Um, his workers weren't super careful with the plants growing around the building when they took it out, and so he owed mine a new garden. But this is a moonlight garden, and some of the earliest examples of moonlight gardens come from 16th century India. There's actually one directly across the street from the Taj Mahal. But by the early 19th century, they had begun to appear in Western culture, designed to be enjoyed at night. The hallmarks include a reflecting pool in the center of the space to catch the moonlight and the starlight. Brightly colored flowers, usually whites, blues, and silvers, are very popular. And plants that'll bloom, become more fragrant, or attract pollinators in the evening. And so the work on the garden had been started by Mina by herself with assistance from local Fort Myers architect Nat Walker, who had worked on some other things on the property. But she was encountering difficulties in realizing her vision, and so she reaches out to Ellen Biddle Shipman for assistance. And so while the architectural layout and the forms prescribed by Ellen were implemented, the planting plan needed adjustment as the recommendations made include plants and flowers that were not really amenable to a subtropical climate. They were northern flowers and plants. This is pretty atypical for Ellen. As I said, she did visit her clients on site a lot of the time, and she is very meticulous and exacting, but it does present an opportunity to assess the Moonlight Garden in relation to her larger work and to highlight some of the particulars of her approach that helped her stand out from her contemporaries. Down here, you'll see the plan for the Moonlight Garden, and I'll have that blown up on a future slide here. And so some of the similarities, it is a small, private, enclosed space. It's a garden room, very lush, romantic drift bed planting style. So the plants, they aren't exactly rigid in their spacing. They kind of overflow into each other. Rotating successional blooms in the borders, so you have an interesting garden throughout the year. You have the evergreen backdrop. Very rustic vernacular architectural features, an axial layout right down the middle, direct relation to the related architecture, as I said, very much related to the study that it is next to. We have a direct collaboration with the homeowner as opposed to Ellen telling Mina what she was going to do. A very extremely detailed and exacting plans, and really it's a perfect encapsulation of the arts and crafts style. Some of the differences, as I said, there was no indication that Ellen ever visited Fort Myers. In another letter to another client, she said, "See me before you see your architect, or even before you buy the grounds." This indicates a level of familiarity and trust between Ellen and Mina, as they had both established themselves in the field and they had worked together multiple times. So when we think about those plants, it may have been an oversight, but it may have been just that she trusted Mina to be able to take care of it if it didn't work out. And she didn't really need to come down here to talk to her directly about it. But yeah, I would say it was really a level of trust between the two women. And there was also no indication that she ever designed a moonlight garden aside from this one. Her designs were traditionally meant for daytime viewing, but this indicates her willingness to be flexible for the client and the skill to adapt as needed. And this is actually a picture I took of the Moonlight Garden during our holiday night celebration a couple of months ago. And so this gives you an idea of what it does look like at night. And here's the layout for the Moonlight Garden. As you can see, the pool, all of these little circles here are different plants. Um, and obviously very exacting instructions about how to care for those plants as well. And so at this time, we hit the Great Depression, 1929. And so some of the work that she did during this time is over here to the right. But she has to balance the loss of her residential project volume with a smaller number of extremely wealthy clients that have depression-proof fortunes, such as the Edisons, the Fords. And this is combined with an increased focus on public and institutional projects, as well as interior design opportunities. So now she gets to move inside the house. We believe that she had about 8 different designs that we know of as far as interior design opportunities. At the same time, she begins to take on public speaking opportunities. And in 1929, she does travel to Italy, and then in the early 1930s takes 2 trips to England. Generally speaking, architects would travel to Europe to study in their early careers, much like artists, landscape artists, especially landscape painters on a grand tour. While the Italian, the English, and other continental styles were known and incorporated by Ellen throughout her career, her delayed opportunity to travel to these places ultimately engendered a uniquely independent and quintessentially American design sensibility. It really allowed her to grow on her own. She wasn't restricted to the same conventions as her contemporaries. And so one of those works that she did in this time period, again, Stan Hewitt, as we saw earlier, owned by the Cyberlings, who owned Goodyear Tire. The original designer was Warren Manning, another famous landscape architect. But we see the Ellen Biddle Shipman redesign of the English garden here. And this is one of the few extant and publicly accessible designs for a private estate that is representative of her specialty, which were small, secluded colonial revival and arts and crafts gardens, just like the Moonlight Garden here today. And you can see the design elements that are common across the two. One of my favorite pieces of work that she did, Longview House and Gardens in New Orleans, Louisiana. You'll notice that this is a time period that covers 8 years. And so the reason for that, she became very good friends with the Stearns, who owned the property. We'll move to the next slide here. Edith Stern was actually the heiress to the Sears Roebuck fortune. And so the house was actually designed by the sons of Charles Platt, her mentor. She also designed the interior of the house, and there's a seamless integration from indoors to outdoors. Ellen was very well renowned as an excellent house guest, and she spent a lot of time here at Longview, walking the grounds with the Stearns and making her decisions about how she's going to build out the landscape. The really interesting thing about this house in particular, so she came, they had a house, and she was designing the gardens around it, and she said, you know what? This house does not fit with what we want to do with the gardens. I encourage you to build a new house. And they actually did it. They moved their original house down the street and then built a brand new house to seamlessly integrate with the gardens. And so each room was also individually designed to relate right next to the garden that I was next to. So you'd stand in a room, look out the window, and that garden outside would be very much seamlessly integrated with the indoors that you were standing in. And so this is probably her most comprehensive and the full expression of her design style. Also, if anybody watching is an American Horror Story fan, they did film the exterior of this for American Horror Story season 4. That's Dandy's house. Here's the plan for Longview in New Orleans here. Another garden she did, and this is the only other garden that we know of that she worked on in Florida, and this is up in Jacksonville. This is the Italian Garden at the Cummer Museum. And we'll talk about this a little bit more as we come to the end here. But as we said, she had kind of been lost to the dustbin of history to a degree. Nobody really knew who Ellen Biddle Shipman was. A lot of her gardens disappeared over the course of 100 years. Of course, there's an ingrained obsolescence in gardens. They're very hard to keep the same over 100 years. Of course, we have the gendered division of labor here and other factors contributing to the fact that she wasn't actually very well known for a while, but a grad student actually found the plans for the Italian garden at the Cummer Museum in the archives at Cornell University, and she is rediscovered. And since then, we've been able to see some more of her work and track down some of the things that she did. And that also leads to her gardens being revived over the last number of years. But here's the Italian garden at the Cummer Museum. And then, of course, unfortunately, we always have hurricanes. And so it was pretty much completely destroyed a number of years ago, but it has been restored now. And you can go and visit that garden today. It's very remarkable. And I'll also point out here, this is also very different from a lot of her other work. And so she's very flexible and able to work in a lot of different traditions. Another garden that she's very famous for is the Terrace Gardens at Duke University, Durham, North Carolina. She was actually related to one of the benefactors for the gardens here at Duke University, another Biddle, Sarah P. Duke. This is the work in progress, and then today. And again, very, very different from her other designs. Very talented. That's the overhead view. And every time I see this, it always reminds me of the Globe Theater, Shakespeare's Globe Theater. But as you can see, a completely different design, very different work that she's doing here compared to what was really her specialty, or even in comparison to some of her other work. And so we come to World War II. The landscape architecture industry is changed irrevocably by the outbreak of war. Ellen says no other industry has been hit harder. Labor and materials are in short supply. There's major changes in lifestyle and culture, especially post-World War II when everybody moves to the suburbs. She does pivot in her business to try to keep herself afloat. She offers an 8-week course for women in engineering and drafting skills. She also proposes to consult with the military on the design of camouflage, which I think is a very ingenious way to put your skills to use. She also volunteers to coordinate the promotion of victory gardens with the U.S. government and the Garden Club of America. There's no real regular work to speak of. People aren't spending their money on lavish private gardens for their estates. She has to cut her staff. She actually stops paying herself a salary. And in October of 1946, she actually sells her New York City property and moves back to Brook Place in Plainfield, New Hampshire, full time. Shortly after that, she closes her practice permanently in early 1947 due to her declining health, and she takes the opportunity to spend more time with her family. Unfortunately, Ellen passed away from pneumonia at the age of 80 on March 27th, 1950 at her Bermuda home. It was called E's House. She is buried in Gilkey Cemetery in Plainfield, New Hampshire. As you can see, her gravestone is very humble. And so her humble gravestone, a very modest cemetery, it belies the beauty that she propagated throughout the country with her landscape designs, but it demonstrates the unassuming grace with which she lived her life. It's very fitting. And so we're going to talk about her legacy as we wrap up here. She did over 600 public and private projects going all the way from Maine to Florida, Louisiana, out to Washington State. Her client list included names such as Edison, Ford, Cyberling, Astor, DuPont, Roosevelt, Rockefeller, Goodyear, Goodrich, Colgate, and many more. She was named the Dean of American Women Landscape Architects by House and Garden in 1933. She also created the first all-woman landscape architecture firm and dedicated her career to providing opportunities of equality for women in the field through hiring practices, education, and mentorship. Gardens, by their nature, as I mentioned, are constantly evolving, subject to the ravages of time. And so also we have shifting social and environmental conditions. And so there's a degree of difficulty in creating a lasting legacy as a garden designer. But she was one of the most notable designers in the American arts and crafts garden movement. She employed a painterly, expressive romanticism that contrasted sharply with the formal and continental influences of her contemporaries. While her work was in high demand by the country's most famous residents for a protracted period throughout the 1920s and 30s, her labor-intensive standards and designs led to an accelerated obsolescence. And this was compounded by the misogyny embedded in her industry and society at large, of course. But it was only through the work of intrepid work, or it was only through the intrepid work of landscape historians like Judith B. Tankard that her legacy has been resurrected and revitalized. And as a result, several historical restorations of her garden spaces have commenced, and this allows her legacy to thrive like never before. And so we are very lucky to have an example of her work here at Edison Ford. Here you'll see some of my work cited. Of course, the principal source was Judith Tankard's The Gardens of Ellen Biddle Shipman. There are a couple copies out there still on eBay and Amazon. All right. I thank you for joining us, and I hope you have a great day. And thanks for coming to learn about Ellen Biddle Shipman.